Welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is hosted by the Getting to Zero Coalition. My name is Sophie Deyon, and I am the Senior Project Manager and Team Lead on Policy and Government Engagement at the Global Maritime Forum. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and welcome our panelists in a moment. Today, we will host an industry panel to look at some of the requirements from the upcoming measures that are being discussed at the moment at the International Maritime Organization. And after a very short introduction on my end and a deep dive from my colleague Femke in a moment on the measures and some of the learnings we've had from engaging with our coalition members, we will have about 30 minutes to dive into some of the key questions out there with our speakers today. We have a diverse panel, and I will introduce them in a moment. And so from my side, just to set the scene, we expect this year, 2025, to be a quite watershed year for the maritime industry because the IMO, as we know, is set to adopt so-called midterm measures to deliver on the greenhouse gas strategy adopted in 2023. And we know that time is pressing, both to deliver on the targets in this strategy for 2030 and 2050 for emission reductions, but also more generally to take action on decarbonization in shipping and not necessarily waiting for the measures to come into place to create change. The measures will expected to be adopted this year, but there will be, of course, a moment before enforcement and implementation. So we see that there is a need to act now more globally. And what's at stake is twofold. The objectives set in the strategy of 2023 touch upon an energy transition, but also a just and equitable transition. And we'll come back to that in a minute in our presentation. But we see the two as very interlinked. And so this is also one of the key challenges that need to be addressed jointly in the upcoming policy measures. There are different instruments being created. We'll take a minute to go through them, and also key open questions still out there in the debate. So this is what we want to focus on today. At the coalition level, we've had several workshops with industry members, but also policymakers, and bringing the two together in public-private dialogues. So we've been listening a lot and learning from these engagements. And today we want to really focus on how the business cases from the different shipping companies can develop and based on what requirements from the policy measures so that we can feed into this debate. But before we get to our speakers, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Femke, who is the Getting to Zero project manager, and she will take us through some of the key aspects of the measure out there, as well as learnings we've had from our stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So let me just share screen. 1 second. There we go. So yes, as you are all aware of, the 2023 greenhouse gas strategy, which was 1.5 years ago, set the ambition for shipping by setting targets for 2030, 2040, and 2050. It also indicated that the measures to ensure the actual implementation of these targets should include an economic and a technical element. Since the adoption of the strategy, the IMO has been working on developing these through the Marine Environment Protection Committee, so the MEPC. And this means that they've been developing and reaching agreement on the legal structure of the measures, as well as supporting guidelines, which include, for example, the guidelines on life cycle assessment of fuels, but also more guidelines to be developed. So then if we look at the actual legal framework itself, it sits within what we call MARPOL, so the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, and especially Annex 6 under MARPOL, which is the prevention of air pollution from ships. And then within that, we're referring to an actual new chapter that's currently being added, which is Chapter 5, or the Net Zero Framework. So right now, there is actual text that the member states in MEPC have been developing in the last 1.5 years. They've been negotiating, but a lot of text is still what we call between brackets. So that means that there's still a lot of text that are different options out there, still text to be decided on, and quite a lot of details to crystallize in the coming months, weeks. We do see quite a lot of movement. We actually moved to actual text that we're now negotiating. We also see movement, especially in the group of the levy proponents that have come together around and going to try and find similarities on their positions to negotiate as a block in terms of, for example, the mechanisms of the fund and how this should work, what this should look like. So while a lot of things are still to be decided, we have actually seen movement in the last 1.5 years or so. But as it is with IMO, everything gets decided, or nothing is decided until everything gets decided. So that also means that we have a lot of remaining questions and not a lot of time to actually decide on these questions. But some of those remaining questions include, for example, the actual regulation on greenhouse gas content of fuels, which are also referred to as Z factors or reduction factors, which are really seen as the core of the global fuel standard, so the technical elements. There's also questions around actual enforcement of these greenhouse gas mandated targets, and this could include fees for non-compliance, which are also referred to as remedial units by some countries or surcharges by other countries. There remains questions around the shape of the actual economic elements, whether it's going to be a universal levy, how it's going to be applied, whether it's going to be a flexible compliance mechanism, or whether it's going to be both, and what the actual levels and details of these different elements and mechanisms should look like. There are questions around the fund mechanisms itself, how to collect the money, how to disperse the revenues, what are some legal implications. We have unclarity about the definition of zero and near zero fuels, zero-emission fuels, which was a concept that was coined in the greenhouse gas strategy of 2023, without actually having a clear definition of what this means. And as I mentioned before, a lot of guidelines, for example, the LCA guidelines. So a lot of remaining questions, but we also have some key milestones coming up in terms of but we can use these different moments to negotiate and find agreement on these questions. So as you can see, there is first an expert workshop coming up in February, which is going to focus on questions around food security.
Slides.
Again, sorry, I'm not sure if can you guys see the slides? I think so. Yes, okay, sorry. I hope everything works, but let me write in the chat, please, if you can't see the slides. There is also an international working group on greenhouse gas emissions, which is a working group specifically under MEPC, focused on these midterm measures, which is the 3rd week of February. There's another one of those coming up the 1st week of April, and then there's actual MEPC 83, which is set to agree on the measures in the 2nd week of April. So it seems like quite a lot of time, but as you heard, there's a lot of remaining questions. So we hope to move forward and find agreement on these questions in the coming months. So now we know what the remaining questions are, we have the strategy, but looking ahead and looking at the transition as a whole, we should also think about where we actually need to go with these measures and what we actually should achieve in the coming years. So the strategy did not only set the actual targets for these years or the kind of the ideas of developing these measures, it also sets out wider objectives. And these wider objectives include, firstly, to achieve an actual energy transition and to enable what we call a just and equitable transition. So then focusing on just and equitable transition, what this means is it means leaving no country behind. And that's a relatively vague concept, but it means in practice that lower income countries are supported in their transition, as the transition is going to be costly and they might not have the resources to transition themselves, but also that any disproportionate negative impacts that come from the measures and the transition in itself are mitigated. And I'll go a little bit later into what this actually means in practice. Then the second objective, an energy transition. An energy transition means then a shift away from fossil fuels to fuels that will actually able to achieve the full emission reduction at the scale that the industry requires. And what this actually means is, well, many studies have shown that the most viable long-term option for these kinds of fuels are likely to be the synthetic hydrogen-based e-fuels produced through renewable energy, which have the best kind of environmental and scalability advantages over options like biofuels, where competition from other sectors and other environmental risks are likely to limit their availability and to skyrocket their prices. But we also all know that the e-fuels that we need are not widely available today, and making them available in time means developing and scaling the value chain already today to avoid investing in temporary solutions that might end up in stranded assets later on. So now we have the strategy, we know where we need to go, we have the remaining questions, but then the question remains really now what? What do we actually need from the measures to be able to get there? And this is a question that we've been quite extensively discussing within the Getting to Zero Coalition, with a lot of you who are here today in our wider workshops, with our strategy group, but also with the Getting to Zero Coalition Policy Action Group. And if we look at these different objectives and we look at the need for an early transition to e-fuels, we look at a transition that needs to be just and equitable, we need multiple elements to fall into place at the same time. And firstly, what we need is really the most basic element, which is a global fuel standard that contains the strong greenhouse gas emission reduction factors that can provide the certainty that we actually reach the targets that are set out in the strategy. But then there's kind of the downside of these emission reduction factors is that it comes with a very high price uncertainty. We know that e-fuels are not available. They're also a lot more expensive than other currently available alternatives. And we can see that the market alone itself is not really creating the business case for these e-fuels. And even with mandated reduction factors, it is more likely that companies are going to opt for cheaper compliance options that are more temporary solutions rather than the solution that is going to get us there in the end. And so the extent to which the GFS and these actual reduction factors are going to be achieved really relies on some other elements to fall into place at the same time. And it's really essential that all of these are in place at the same time because they work together in such a kind of clear and coherent way. And so the first element that we need is an actual universal greenhouse gas levy, because what this does is it directly closes some of that cost gap between zero-emission fuels and fossil fuels by making fossil fuels more expensive, but it also creates a very predictable and a kind of reliable incentive not to use fossil fuels. There is an alternative which is referred to as a credit trading system, but it comes with multiple risks in terms of supporting the kind of the implementation of the GFS. So it cannot, for example, provide that reliability or predictability that comes with a levy, which can then complicate investments, especially for actors like fuel producers or infrastructure developers. And this is going to negatively impact that fuel availability that we need. But it's also likely to hit developing countries a lot harder, as these regions are a lot more likely to under-comply, which means that they are not going to be able to actually meet the baselines that are set. They're going to have to pay more than the countries or the ship owners are running to more wealthier regions. And so if we now assume that we have the levy, that also means that we'll have a lot of revenue that's going to be generated. And these revenues themselves are kind of leading to next two pillars that we need to be able to actually deliver on the GFS. The second pillar being the actual revenues going to the rewards that are kind of specifically targeting scalable zero-emission fuels rather than a broad category of near zero and zero-emission fuels. Because this really helps bring this business case for e-fuels. E-fuels are a lot further away from commercial and technical kind of viability, plus they are the most viable long-run option, and rewarding these e-fuels as early on as possible is going to help build that business case and help us get to that early transition. And then the third pillar, which is around the revenues to be spent on a just and equitable transition. So companies need their business cases for e-fuels. We have now kind of heard that it's really in the best interest for industry to focus on an early transition to e-fuels. And we need a levy to get us to that early transition. But a levy also, similar to other economic elements, comes with a high impact on developing states. It will have high negative impacts on developing states through, for example, rising trade costs or impacting food security. And these impacts need to be mitigated as well. And a levy is both creating this impact, but it's also the best mechanism to actually mitigate these impacts by supporting revenue distribution to countries, both countries who actually have the opportunities related to shipping, but also countries who are negatively impacted and who don't necessarily have any opportunities related to shipping and the wider energy value chain. So really kind of the broad spending of money on a just and equitable transition. So these are really kind of the things, the messages that the coalition has been working on, developing together with the Getting to Zero coalition, with many of you here. And so I'll hand it back over to Sophie, and then we'll dive a little bit more into these details and hear from different perspectives of the value chain and what this means for them.
Thank you very much, Femke. And this was, I think, a great kickoff to give us a sense of what we want to cover in this panel. Now turning to the panel invitees today, we will focus on how, and building on what Femke has been telling us about what's being discussed at the IMO. Our intention is to look at how can a separate levy support a business case for zero-emission fuels, and what are the key elements needed from the measures. And we will do that by having 4 representatives from different parts of the value chain. We will have a fuel producer, a bunker supplier, a port, and a cargo owner, so that we cover diverse representation and diverse views. So with us on the panel today, I would like to introduce first Nirva Ghelani, who is the lead principal sustainability and maritime decarbonization at BHP, BHP being a leading mining company based in Australia and also a leading producer of iron ore and copper involved in green corridors. Nirva, welcome.
Thank you, Sophie. Hi, everyone. My name is Nirva, and I look after the maritime decarbonization portfolio here at BHP. As Sophie has mentioned, BHP is a natural resources company, and we have assets globally in Australia as well as South America, and soon to be in Canada as well. We are also one of the largest dry bulk charterers in the world, which basically lends ourselves very well to items like decarbonization, which are necessary to uplift the industry, as well as bring the knowledge and the actions right back to the center of what we are doing. I'm based here in Singapore, and very happy to be participating in this discussion, which is a very critical topic. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Nirva, and we'll come back to you in a very short moment. Next, I would like to introduce Lahana Kushbandi, who is CEO at ET Fuels, which is an off-grid green fuel producer of e-methanol. And you have projects in Finland, Spain, and the US, Lara, and I think it's quite a new but vocal organization you've been part of the creation of, so very happy to hear your views.
Sure. Well, first of all, congratulations on pronouncing my surname correctly. Amazing. Great start. I am, as you say, the CEO of ET Fuels. We are a e-fuels producer or developer at the moment, with 7 sites, 7 projects under production. In my previous life, actually, somewhat similar to Nirva, I also worked in the mining industry, and relevant because I sat on the other side rather than trying to sell fuels. I was the CFO of Rio Tinto's commercial arm, so was on the risk management and procurement side as well. So very excited to get into the detail today, and thank you for having us.
Thank you to you. We will then welcome Maja Schippers-Kuhn, Director of Environmental Regulatory and Public Affairs at Bunker Holding, based in Denmark. And Bunker Holding is the world's leading company in bunker trading. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Very pleased to be here. I joined Bunker Holding just 1.5 years ago, and as you said, yes, we're the biggest supplier in the world, responsible for around 15% of all fuels traded and supplied in the world. Prior to that, I worked for Danish shipping, so I've been following and sitting in as advisor to the IMO negotiation for 15 years now. So I've seen everything from baby steps from nothing happening to the design index being adopted to, but we can never regulate the existing fleet, to where we are today. So when people are complaining and say, you know, I'm always like watching paint dry and nothing happens, I must say I have faith in IMO, and I'm hopeful. I'm not naive, but I'm hopeful and glad to be here.
Thank you so much. We share the same hope, and you're indeed very well placed to enlighten us today. And finally, last but not least, Manfred Lebmeier, who is Senior Environmental Advisor at Hamburg Port Authority, so our port representative for today from Germany's largest port, and also one of the busiest in Europe. Welcome, Manfred.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting us. Port of Hamburg is, as I said, the biggest seaport in Germany, and we are a universal port. We're handling almost everything, and we are also a big industrial area. So it's not only ships coming into our port, we handle and fuel as well. So and distribute fuel in our port since more than 100 years. So Port of Hamburg is an energy hub. We were an energy hub and will be an energy hub in the future. The future more for green fuels, for e-fuels, probably. But so we are very well in the business. And we as Port of Hamburg, we decided that the topic is so important that we developed last year a new department for energy solutions to tackle this topic directly. And part of this new department. So I'm happy to contribute, and I want to add that it's not only IMO looking at this topic, it's also the European Union. We are tackled, or we are hit by the Green Deal and all these new regulations. And for us, it's very important that the EU regulation and IMO regulation should be somehow aligned and not in contradiction. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. And indeed, that's something we're hoping to explore today as well, the different levels of policy and actions required, with a certain focus on the IMO, considering the upcoming measures under discussion. We have prepared a certain number of questions, but please do write your comments or questions in the chat if you have any, and we'll monitor that. And if we have a few minutes to engage at the end, we'll take that time. Otherwise, we'll follow up with some of the panelists after the webinar to answer some questions that we can't cover today. I would like to start with you, Nirva. BHP is actively engaged in a Green Corridor consortium focusing on iron ore between Australia and Japan. And green corridors play a huge role in the transition to new fuels. So one of the key things that you have been working in that context is exploring new commercial engagements and arrangements to share the green premium that comes with greener fuels. I would like to ask you by telling us, according to you, what is the role of the IMO to overcome the challenge of the cost gap between conventional and greener fuels, and thinking also of policy more broadly, what can national governments already help with, and how can the IMO come in complement of that, to what extent, on what?
Sophie, thank you so much for that question. I think that is a very broad, sort of very nice foundational question that really needs to be discussed in this topic today. IMO, as I see it, is really the critical sort of role that they play is providing that framework, that regulatory framework to the industry, in addition to being an enabler to actually allowing the industry to execute and sort of achieve what those regulations or what those demands of the future maritime industry are. So in my mind, that's sort of how IMO's role sort of plays, and when it comes to decarbonization, this is exactly the two areas that we currently need the most support on, and these are the areas or challenges that the industry is grappling with, both in terms of the pace of decarbonization as well as the development of various solutions that we have. So one of the important things that I think shouldn't be a surprise to anyone is the role of IMO in sort of setting some of those regulatory targets or regulatory alignments, which will then actually set the pace for decarbonization for the entire industry, and then sort of looking at what are the ways in which that can be enabled, what are the ways in which the local as well as the international bodies can actually come into play to provide different sorts of subsidies, different sorts of mechanisms that will actually help to either defray or support some of the initial capex investments and cost infrastructures. I think that is where the role of IMO is very, very critical, and that is how sort of the international as well as the local jurisdictions sort of should take that slightly differing, however at the same time in tandem approach to ensure that the pace of decarbonization is well managed, and as we sort of get to 2030 and then towards 2050, the industry is not pressurized to do a lot of things in the later years, but that there's a steady pace towards having solutions that are available and that can be adopted by the industry.
Thanks a lot, Nirva. Yeah, I understand also from your angle, we know this energy transition is happening, so it's more about how and when and how smooth and efficient we can make it through the different measures. And Manfred, you already mentioned the EU as a key contributor also in the wider space. I would like to move to Lara for our next question, actually on what have we learned so far from EU measures like FuelEU Maritime that should also be applied to the IMO framework, considering that we're trying to promote the most green fuels down the line, using e-fuels for compliance under FuelEU Maritime. What has it been like so far? Thanks, Lara.
What has it been like? Yeah, an interesting journey. I mean, look, to summarize, I have had, as you would imagine, a lot of discussions with both customers and investors, and both of those parties are really keen to get into the business case behind FuelEU, because ultimately, no offtakes if there's no business case, no investment if there's no offtakes, and no e-fuels if there's no investment, right? And I will start by saying, as someone developing e-methanol projects, you know, this is a fuel which is technically viable today, and for which the only real barrier is offtake. I will say I love FuelEU. It is incredibly helpful to our business and to our fuel. But as much as I love it, it is incredibly complicated to understand. And so, you know, when we talk to customers and they actually do the maths on FuelEU, they realize it provides a very robust business case, and we have some really good conversation, and we're starting to move in the right direction to get offtakes. But like I said, it is complicated. And I think one of the learnings for the IMO is that FuelEU is in place now. And I would say 5% of the customers that we speak to really understand how it works. And so getting the right balance between incentivizing and bringing together a business case for e-fuels, but doing so in a simple way is critical. And if I go into a bit more detail on what I mean by that, really there are, in my mind anyway, 3 components that the regulation must have to drive e-fuels adoption. So the first is something that specifically targets e-fuels. There are lots of alternative fuels available, lots of alternative pathways available to decarbonize. We know that e-fuels is really the only sustainable, scalable solution, medium and near term. But to incentivize those, there must be something in the measures that really calls out e-fuels. And look, you know, FuelEU Maritime does that with the e-fuels multiplier, with the e-fuels quota. And so having something similar in IMO is going to be absolutely critical. The second component is really the size of the penalty for non-compliance or the reward for compliance. FuelEU, you know, the carbon price equivalent that we have in that penalty is 640 euros per tonne. That helps us, and that does close the gap between e-fuels and other fuels. If we can't close that gap, there's no point talking. You know, EU ETS does not do anything really to drive e-fuels adoption. So someone in the IMO needs to do the analysis of, this is how much it costs to produce e-fuels, this is how much it costs to use LNG, biofuels, etc., and make sure that the penalty is big enough to close that gap. It's relatively simple maths. I would say, maybe to policymakers out there, we developers love to underbake our actual costs. And so making sure that those costs are real costs is going to be critical. So that's the second piece, Sophie. And then the third piece really is around incentivizing early movers. if I had $1 for every shipping company that has said to me, I want to be sustainable, I want to be compliant, but I will be a fast follower. I mean, look, we wouldn't need regulation, right? My fuel would pay for itself. And so having something in there that Fuel EU has, which says, you know, the multiplier, it really helps companies before 2034. That first mover incentive is absolutely critical. So hopefully the IMO can think about that. I think on the flip side, look, Fuel EU is complicated. And if I compare and contrast to, you know, some of the other tax incentives or, you know, fuel incentives that we at ET Fuels are pursuing, what's really driving investment are things like the IRA, which is a very, very simple production tax credit. That is driving billions of dollars into, you know, green and other types of industries. If I look at, you know, SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, they have very simple quotas. And again, when we talk to investors, investors understand quotas means offtakes, means investment. And so trying to get the balance between e-fuel focus, high enough penalty, first mover incentives, and simplicity is going to be critical.
Thanks so much, Lara, for also being very clear. I don't even have to summarize your points. You've done it yourself. That's a very clear message for e-fuels. And in that context, I would like to move to you, Maria, because we do see that the future for the fuel industry will be to have a multi-fuel industry, where scalable zero-emission fuels like green ammonia will likely make up a significant or more significant part of the fuel mix. To achieve our decarbonization goal. And from Bunker Holdings' perspective, as a supplier of bunker fuels, what is required from the policy measures on the table to ensure the transition is also efficient?
Well, thank you very much, Sophia. First of all, I would like to say that I very much agree with both Nirva and Lara. And for us, the most important thing is the regulatory certainty and the long horizon here we're looking into, because these investments take time to materialize in terms of production facilities and energy infrastructure, etc. I would actually go as far as to say that the ships and the engines, bearing in mind that we don't have the ammonia engine yet commercially available, that's not really the big issue here in terms of investments. That's onshore, it's production facilities, and it's energy infrastructure that we really need here. And that is not something that is under the sphere of control of the shipping industry itself. And that's why we need to have the whole maritime value chain working together. But the main driver here, as we see it, are the regulatory measures. And that's why we also really welcome both Fuel EU Maritime, but also the ETS system. And yes, ETS does not drive the uptake of alternative fuels. It only drives improved energy efficiency. But whereas the Fuel EU Maritime then for the first time ever sets requirements for the greenhouse gas intensity on board the vessels. And that's the first time ever that the shipping industry has actually been regulated. And when you look at the commercial fleet out there today, the 65,000 vessels, 1% of them are burning alternative fuels. This is a fossil fuel driven industry. And that has to do with the fact that so far regulation, both at EU level, until 2 weeks ago when the Fuel EU Maritime came into force, and then at IMO level, it has only been targeting energy efficiency for new builds and then also the existing fleet. So the shipping industry is a slow mover here compared to our biggest competitors when it comes into the fuel market, and that's the road sector and aviation, of course. We're all competing for the same molecules here. So coming back to answer your question, Sophie, what do we need from the IMO? We need 2 measures that will enable the industry, not only the shipping industry, but the whole maritime value chain, to actually fulfill the targets laid out in the GHG reduction strategy from 23. That strategy is a policy document. It's not a legally binding document. That was the easy part of the 176 member states to get together and agree on that. And there was a very nice atmosphere in the room when they did that. But now is the hard part, and that's to agree on the regulatory measures, because without the regulatory measures, we won't get there. It's as simple as that. We're talking about two measures. On the one hand, an economic measure, on the other hand, a fuel standard. So two measures kind of similar to what we have at the EU, something with, a price on carbon, not a trading system like we have with the EUAs in the EU. And then on the other hand, something that sets requirements for the GHG intensity within the fuel burned. Our challenge here is that it's easier for 27 member states to agree on the policy measures. It's difficult for 176 countries worldwide with completely various socioeconomic points of departure, etc. Plus, we're also having some high politic tensions in here. So there are a lot of jokers in these negotiations. And sometimes it's not really about shipping. It's not shipping that's really the center of discussion at IMO. It's more high politics between developing and developed countries, small island states, etc. That's why we all of a sudden have, words like food security, and now we're having an expert workshop on food security, and that's because there are countries that are concerned about the socioeconomic effects. And then we also have really big players that are, the geopolitical tensions, where you have China, you have the US with the incoming Trump administration. How will that affect the negotiations? Bearing in mind that we actually did manage to agree on the initial strategy back in 2018 when Trump was in office. The US was not happy. They were trying to delay everything, but it did get adopted nevertheless. So we have a lot of more political jokers here. So although I completely agree with you, Lara, in the perfect world, we should have those incentives that you mentioned. But there are so many other factors that needs to be taken into consideration when you need to have consensus among the 176 member states. But I'm still hopeful that we'll make it this spring. Thank you.
Thank you. To end on this happy note as well. Yeah, we see a need for simplicity and, of course, a lot of challenges still that need to be addressed within a very short timeline. But as you say, I wouldn't say the strategy was easy in itself. It was a complex process to get there, observing from afar. But this is now even more of an important time for the IMO to be able to deliver on these concepts. And I would like now to move to the infrastructure side of things. We have Manfred from Port of Hamburg, and I would like to ask you from the port's perspective and for your business case, what is required to invest in zero-emission infrastructure and particularly for e-fuels? And how can global rewards targeting e-fuels specifically help you de-risk investments?
Thanks a lot. To be very honest, I think everything is said already from the ladies before. We providing infrastructure. And infrastructure first needs a predictable market and it needs time. So if there's a predictable market, companies will invest, but this investment will not happen from today until tomorrow. So if there's a regulation or something in place, we need some time to build up this infrastructure. So that's one requirement. And as my speakers before said, we need a predictable market. Otherwise, no one will invest in infrastructure because the amount of investment is so high. So, and we have this first mover disadvantage already mentioned. That companies who want to invest first, as first movers here, have a lot of disadvantage. And here comes the special role of ports into play. A lot of permitting issues are there. Nobody knows already if we want to supply ammonia, what are the requirements for permits to bunker ammonia? Here, we as ports have the target to bring to make ammonia bunkering alive. For the moment, it's not allowed. So we have to change this. We have to find regulations to give. We need these permits and all this stuff. We have to do. But again, this all requires time. This won't happen tomorrow. And so we need a predictable regulation, a predictable market to make all these things happen, that this first mover disadvantage is not there anymore. And people and companies are really keen to invest in such a new infrastructure.
Thanks. I suppose that's also a hopeful note. The companies are willing. And thank you for also touching upon some specific challenges to specific fuels like ammonia. That's a very important point to address. I would like to get back to you, Lara. We've talked about what's needed from the measures on the general front, but also we would like to look at what are the actual measures being considered. And in that respect, I saw a question in the chat, and that's the next one we have for you, so that we can address the two at the same time. What are the actual risks that you see for the targeted support to e-fuels that you mentioned before is needed if the measures that are coming do not come with a universal price on emissions through a levy mechanism, which also includes a reward specifically to target e-fuels? What are the risks? What would happen?
Yeah. No, look, I think there's a few things. Ultimately, my view is that the shipping industry ultimately ends up paying a higher price over the medium to long term, right? Because everybody will focus on what they're doing today, which is the quick and easy, the fast food, biofuels, LNG, I can do more of the same. And they won't take the time to prepare the healthy foundations for the future. And we see that today, right? I mean, people are buying LNG ships, which are locking themselves into fossil fuel pathways because of the regulatory uncertainty around what's happening in the IMO. And we'll just see more of that, right? If we don't get clear incentives for e-fuels, which ultimately means that in 15 years' time, people will be halfway through, using assets which are no longer fit for purpose. And so, I mean, for the industry overall, I think you'll see higher costs. So that's one. I think from an investment point of view, these projects, as Manfred said, they take time, and infrastructure takes time to develop. So if we want fuels in 2030, a good rule of thumb is that you need to see the investment start 5 years in advance. And so all that will happen is, of course, if we don't see clear regulation, the money won't flow in. And more than the money not flowing in, the money will go elsewhere. So I'll give you an example. ET Fuels, we have spent 99% of our time looking at methanol into the marine industry. It works, it's technically viable, ships are using methanol today. But the reality is we are now actively exploring methanol into jet because we see clear incentives there. And so we are thinking, let's move our end market into that where there are clearer signals, and our investors are following. So I think there's an investor risk appetite that will be at risk if we don't see those incentives. And then look, I think the third piece, this is more of a hypothesis rather than a very clear view, but I think we'll also see increasing divergence between the haves and the have-nots within the shipping world. What I mean by that is, if you have to take a bet on where the regulation is going, some will invest and some will not. And as a result, some will be prepared and others will be left behind. And I think that sort of fair playing field, as you call it, which we are in today, because of this regulation, is going to go away. And what that means for the industry, I think, will be quite disruptive. But obviously, we'll see how that all pans out.
Thanks a lot, Lara. And you provide a perfect transition to what was going to be my next question to you, Maria, on also touching upon the just and equitable dimension part of the strategy that we are to deliver on. You mentioned, Maria, earlier that there are different sets of countries, various geographies involved, and political games at stake to get to an agreement. What we know is that some of the measures have opportunities to unlock also opportunities in diverse geographies, but in fact, the e-fuel production, as so far as it is mainly planned in the global north. You, as Bunker Holding, is active in different geographies. So what are some of the key barriers you see that need to be addressed to unlock these opportunities in the global south as well? And how can the revenue disbursement mechanism, part of the measure, help overcome these barriers?
Well, first of all, I think that has really changed in the recent years when you sitting and listen to debates at IMO, where you hear the developing countries. They have also now realized that this could be a business opportunity. Many of them are the source of the green feedstock needed in the production, i.e. wind or solar energy. And I think we have some excellent examples in Namibia, for instance, that are really active on this agenda. So it has really been about, turning this around and turning this debate into not this developing versus developed countries like we have at the UNFCCC discussions. I think we're past that point now. We're not talking about the differentiated responsibilities of these countries anymore, like they are at the UNFCCC. We're talking about no more favorable treatment of flags of ships, so that all ships, no matter what flag they fly, they have to adhere to the same regulation. So coming back to the fact, looking at where these fuels should be produced, they should of course be produced where it makes the most sense and where you have the components that should be in the fuel, i.e. where you have the green feedstock. And that's where it's so important to have the Global South on board here. In order to get an economic measure adopted, it's very, very clear that there will have to be some of the revenue that will go to developing countries. And that has been widely accepted. It wasn't a few years ago by the shipping industry, for instance, but that is widely accepted now, that is part of the deal. And how that should then be again specifically described and decided upon, of course, that's a political decision among the member states, but definitely there are some good opportunities for developing projects in terms of production facilities, etc. Now, I was just following the chat here, so if I may, just a quick comment on the 5% target. I think it is that Tristan Smith is referring to, on how to define that in terms of should it be e-fuels or should it more be an intensity threshold. Definitely, it would be good if there was a clear definition of that 5%. And yes, from our perspective, we would prefer, instead of saying e-fuels, we would prefer a percentage threshold in terms of greenhouse gases. And the reason why is that you still, no matter what you do, and you look at the order book, still it's not, you don't have enough vessels to be able to burn the e-fuels as of today. So we need to do this gradually. And even though right now the order book are made up mostly of LNG capable vessels, but remember, yeah, LNG is a fossil fuel, but it's a stepping stone towards bio-LNG and e-LNG, and the energy infrastructure can be used for ammonia. So it's not a total lock-in with the use of LNG, not that you're supposed to be burning on LNG all the way to 2050, because that will not make you go to zero. But I think we should not try to let the best become the enemy of the good. So instead of having its very narrow focus on just e-fuels, I think we might kill our, the good purpose here. So let's, instead, that's also why the EU countries are advocating to have a percentage, because you can also use biofuels in order to reach that 90% target. So going forward, it's about widening and being more realistic, I think, for now, because we need the vessels capable of burning that, and we need the incentives for the investments in those vessels, and they will not be in the water within the next 2 to 5 years, but the decisions will be made today.
Thanks, Maria. And that, of course, brings us back to the points made earlier by Lara on indeed the risk of lock-in effect that could come with not favoring e-fuels specifically as needing more support overall than other fuels at this present moment. Of course, other speakers are free to also express their views on this point. I'm going to come to you, Manfred and Nirva. Lara, was there something you wanted to?
Yeah, I was going to type away, but I mean, look, I think on the risk point, so pros and cons, right? So I think it's important to dissect where are the actual risks. So from a procurement perspective, there really are three risks, right? Is this fuel going to show up? Which, of course, for e-fuels, you have higher delivery risk than biofuels LNG. So that has to be managed, but can be managed over time, right? I think when it comes to the business case, though, there are two risks, and I think people fundamentally underestimate the existing risk that we have. The first risk is if I'm choosing between fuels, what actual fuel price am I using for LNG, for VLSFO, for e-fuels? The great thing about e-fuels is that typically you're going to contract on a fixed price basis. So from a pricing perspective, you are fundamentally de-risked actually if you're buying e-fuels. That's one. I think the second piece though around the risk profile associated with, you know, green fuels is how much risk is there around the regulatory measures? Now, if you're trying to manage EU ETS exposure, I mean, that is virtually impossible. You know, people do not know the price of EU ETS in 2 days, let alone 2 years. So for those kind of floating penalties, very, very hard to invest in green fuels. But if you're talking about something like Fuel EU, where the penalty is fixed, actually, again, the investment case is substantially de-risked because you know the price of the e-fuel, you know the price of the penalty, and so it's a relatively easy calculation in a spreadsheet. So we actually, Keith, often pitch e-fuels as being a lower risk option relative to the price exposure you might face with the conventional fuels.
Thanks, very clear, Lara. And yeah, again, I'm going to move to the next question. We're also running slowly out of time. And Manfred, I wanted to ask you what are some of the concrete incentives and actions that ports are already taking or can take in addition to ensure the early uptake of e-fuels, also in addition and in complement to the IMO measures. And of course, feel free to react to the earlier discussion also on specific support to e-fuels.
Yes, thanks. So what does it mean if new fuels come into a port? So if it's just one fuel, we can take clear action, but for the moment it looks like that there will be a bunch of fuels coming into our port, and we have to make it happen in our port. And it, not only in our port, also in the other ports, as Maria mentioned, in every port should this happen, also in the not so much developed countries. Therefore, we as ports, together with IAPH, we developed a so-called port readiness level, where we can make a self-assessment how far we are with the opportunity to bunker different fuels. So is a port ready to bunker ammonia? Is a port ready to bunker methanol? Is a port ready to bunker hydrogen? With the self-assessment tool, the port readiness level, we can answer by ourselves a lot of questions, and then we come up to a level from, oh yes, we are totally ready, we can do it, or we are just in the beginning. And this tool helps all ports to make a clear statement to an investor. So if you invest in our port, you can bunker it immediately, or it takes us still 5 years, 10 years, then you can bunker it. And this tool is publicly available for all ports. This will help all ports to make bunkering of fuel happen in their ports and give a good timeline to everybody who wants to invest in our ports. And the same, if this new fuel come to the market and will be on ships, we as ports try to attract these ships into our port. So we want to have these new fuels, these low carbon fuels in our port. And therefore we have the IPH developed an incentive scheme, the Environmental Ship Index, where we as port can give incentives. And this ship index is transformed from the old just looking on SOx and NOx emission into looking more into greenhouse gas emissions, and here especially on the carbon fuel intensity, which is related to the use of e-fuels. And this starts next year, 26. So we as ports have some tools to make bunkering of these new fuels happen in our port, and also to attract these new fuels into our port.
Thanks a lot, Manfred. I think we can, that's a nice closing to the big part of the discussion we had on the global measures at stake here. I would like to end this panel on a more specific note, also staying in a hopeful mood as we've been all along this discussion, and assuming that we are now in execution stage of the policy measures. One of the key challenges that we see, and the key question that will come, is still the robust certification of e-fuels globally. Nirva, I would like to ask you, how important is such certification for BHP as a cargo owner and charterer, and what should the IMO do in that regard?
I think certification is a very, very critical part of the whole value chain, and it gives basically gives the assurance that the life cycle emissions as well as the feedstock and the sourcing is as it should be, or as is being purchased by the off-taker. So in that sense, the certification is very, very critical. And as was discussed earlier in the panel, that the source of the fuel or the location of the source is not necessarily very close or in tandem with where the fuel is actually going to be used. So in that sense, the certification and that entire link of the source to the final utilization is very, very critical. IMO needs to play a very important role in this space by bringing the industry together to set up a framework which can actually allow a certification measure to come into place. We have had multiple organizations as well as independent bodies trying to set up book and claim systems or certification systems on a smaller regional local levels. But if we want the adoption of fuels to happen at a global scale, then IMO needs to come into place and bring that framework into play as well.
Thank you so much, Nirva. And unfortunately, we will have to close this panel shortly, but I want to thank you all, both panelists who have accepted to join us today, but also all the active stakeholders who have contributed on the chat. It's been great to be able to also react to some of your comments live, and we're happy to follow up individually on some of those that we may not have had time to address. I would like to just close up by saying that we've touched upon very important topics today, and some of which, if I can try to summarize, are some of the requirements we identified from the policy measures are creating regulatory certainty and also taking into account the need to remain relatively simple, so the complex element. The need for targeted support for e-fuels and for clear incentives through the rewards, penalties, or and how can we make sure that revenue goes to where we need it to be, including for e-fuels, but also taking into account the just and equitable transition dimension. We've also touched upon the need for collaboration throughout the value chain. That's something we're trying to achieve here, and through our efforts for engagements at the Getting to Zero Coalition. Please do more of that with us. We are always interested to exchange on these questions, to learn from you, from your experience and your barriers and challenges in the context of the business case at different segments and levels of the value chain. So please keep doing that, but you can also, of course, do so much on your own end by participating to IMO meetings, engaging with industry associations in your national countries. Just engaging as widely as you can. This is a very short and important moment that we're in to create the momentum that we need to get to deliver on this strategy already adopted. So thanks today for joining us again, and the webinar will be available for some time on LinkedIn. So please don't hesitate to share with your community if you want them to listen in. Thanks again. Hope to see you again soon.